Hi, welcome to valuationpodcast.com, a podcast and video series about all things related to business and valuation. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I'm a financial mediator and business valuation expert in St. Louis, Missouri. I have the pleasure today of interviewing Ann Priftis. She is a CEO of a group of 7 contemporary art galleries across the U.S. and Canada, and she helps collectors build wealth and a family legacy through art. She also understands the value of art. And so today we're actually going to discuss women, wealth, and the future of art value, which I think is going to be a very interesting conversation. Welcome, Ann. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, this is great because one of the first things that we were talking about kind of in a pre-call, and we're going to talk about values and we're going to talk about art collection. And I know that this is interesting information for everyone, but we also started talking about how the world is changing. And I think it's interesting because, you own specific galleries that people would normally come into, view art, maybe new artists, and maybe buy things that they wouldn't normally have looked at. But the world is changing and a lot of things are going online. And that's where we kind of started the conversation is, what does this mean for art galleries or art in general? And how is the art world changing that maybe we don't know about?
Well, it's a good question because how is the art world changing and how should it be changing are kind of the two questions to ask. So I'm about to make myself sound like a dinosaur here, but it's just a fact. When I started in this industry about 30 years ago, the model was very different. And I think it's still kind of what we think of when we think of traditional art galleries. There's a white box kind of model where you have this very austere setting, usually in a major city, and you have an exhibition of 1 or 2 artists. The exhibition stays up for 6 to 8 to 10 weeks of this one artist or 2 artists, and the gallery promotes that artist and represents them exclusively. Now, speed up time a little bit and the internet kicks in, and galleries start to kind of experiment with this. And really up until maybe a couple years before COVID, that model just wasn't gaining that much traction. So there were a lot of really great online business tools like ArtNet or Artsy, where there were these aggregators. So as a professional seller, meaning a gallery or an advisor, you'd upload your inventory and you had the opportunity to promote and sell your work online, almost like a virtual gallery, but they weren't in situ. So it was individual objects kind of isolated on the screen. And the general feedback around that was that people just didn't feel comfortable buying art online. And there was this very distinct value threshold with what people did feel comfortable with. And at the time, again, pre-COVID, maybe this was 2015, 16, it was about $500. That price point was really low. So most of these traditional white box galleries where they're selling work for $5,000, $125,000 and up, this just wasn't helpful for them. Yet there was this feeling, this shared sentiment of this is the future, right? So right. It's this quandary of, we know this is coming. We know we need to have a presence online, but this doesn't really work for our industry yet. What do we do? And it was that strange thing about luxury meeting convenience. Do people want and can they have that luxury experience online? Is it possible to create that somehow in a remote way? And so I think that COVID played a really critical role in kind of speeding up that process where all of a sudden we didn't have an option. People right. couldn't go into a Louis Vuitton store and have that bespoke experience and speak to a consultant in person and touch the leather and pick up the handbag. And so they were forced to kind of adapt that to an online experience. And some industries did that much better than others. I'd say the gallery world was kind of about it, but it did force us to come up with this tool called we were calling it the OVR, the online viewing room. And so that's really where you saw the gallery as a physical space then turn into this sort of like 3D experience online where you could see the exhibition, walk through it. You could turn, face a wall, see the painting. You could see it above a couch. kind of a thing.
Wow.
Yeah, and so that changed for sure. So what happened is that after COVID, then galleries then took that hybrid approach of like, okay, we're still going to have this online presence and we will continue to do exhibitions, blah, blah, blah. What we're seeing now is that with the rising cost of real estate, the rising cost of everything really globally, and especially in these major cities where galleries tend to be located, traditional galleries just can't keep up with it. So 90% of galleries are small businesses. You read about the Gagosians of the world, the Hausers and Wirth, the Paces. Those are the really big white box galleries that have a multinational presence. They might have 6 locations, 6 brick and mortar locations. But beyond those handful of galleries, and really it is a handful, most are running 1 to 2 locations, usually a couple thousand square feet, very small staff, very scrappy, and they don't have corporate underwriting. They're bankrolling their own operations. And so the model has had to shift now because of that. So one of the questions that we see a lot is, do we need to keep opening physical locations? Can we just go 100% online? And the answer to that is like, yeah, people still want to see art in person. It's a very tangible thing. It's obvious. It's a very visual visual experience. You really want to be able to see that stuff in person. Now, where we are seeing some changes in acquisition trends is that if a collector is comfortable with a specific artist already, if they've collected work by that artist, or they know that artist's practice, if they haven't seen that specific piece that's online, they're going to be comfortable buying it because they already get the look and feel and the aesthetic and the overall quality of the work. If it's a net new artist to them or artwork, that might be a challenge. So there are these kind of nuances that are taking place now. One of the other things that personally I was very happy to step away from during COVID was art fairs. So now there's something like 80 art fairs a year, so something wild like that. The average cost to participate in an art fair for an art gallery is somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000. It's an extremely expensive endeavor. And again, really taxing on your staff. You have people that are on their feet in the booth for 8 to 10 hours a day. You're doing client work prior to when you open up the booth. You're going out to dinner at night and making deals. So it's a 7-day slog. The run up to that is incredibly intense. And then the follow-up, of course, is also intense. So it's just a huge investment of resources. And, during COVID, of course, none of that could happen. And so I thought there'd be this correction. And many of us in the industry have talked about that, like, oh, this is going to be the great reckoning with art fairs. And nope, COVID ended and more art fairs proliferated. So we have learned nothing from that experience, at least in terms of art fairs. And, it's something that's kind of coming to a head at this point, because again, just like the brick and mortar space, it's untenable from a financial standpoint. So I think we'll see a change in that too.
Well, and I think what was interesting when you were first talking is that I would imagine there's a lot of art that's bought, because you are very viscerally affected by it, right? And so you see it, you're in person, it feels like a quick purchase, kind of thing. And I could absolutely see how the value would seem less, right? Like it would almost devalue it if I don't have that same visceral kind of feeling experience. And so I think it's fascinating that you said like that threshold was like $500 for somebody to buy. Because if they're buying like a $20,000 piece of art or a $50,000 piece of art, are they getting that same kind of charge from it that makes them make that purchase very quickly? And you and I had talked a little bit about like that's where you're bringing storytelling into some of these artists, because again, if I don't know who they are, I'm like, oh, I love that. Oh, $50,000. Let me think about it. Click, and you're out of the situation. Like, how are you preserving value in that capacity when people, people want to be online. Like they don't want to travel to Vancouver or New York or Chicago or somewhere like that. And just to see that art, especially if they have the means or the wherewithal, like how are you still capturing that value when some of that feeling is lost? It's a very
Yeah,
interesting.
and you need that. You absolutely need that feeling in order to justify that this is a luxury experience, or this is something special and different. So what we've found, and what off-piece fine arts does, I think, masterfully, I've never seen another art-based business operate at this level in this way, is they've created this real hybrid experience for collecting art. So we have the 7 brick and mortar galleries. We have 6 in Canada and 1 in the US in Sun Valley, Idaho. But the majority of our sales happen online. But here's what's interesting. There isn't a shop now experience on our website. So there's no way that as a collector and as a visitor to the sites, you can purchase art by clicking a button. The farthest you can go is have a live chat with one of our art consultants, or you can hit a button where you inquire. And then that's when you get turned over to a live person who's one of our art consultants, who's highly trained, understands all of the stories about all of the artists. And that's where they start to develop that relationship with the collector. And, we start to look at the data behind that customer experience. And it's super interesting because many times a client clicks on something and thinks they want that thing, but you see where the conversation goes. And many times they end up acquiring something else. Sometimes it'll be by the same artist, but it'll be a different piece, or it'll be a similar style, but by a different artist. They just didn't know that we carried that piece, or they didn't see it online. And so that conversation is still incredibly important in this industry. I don't really see it ever going away. I see it evolving again, and this is where AI comes in. You can have some of that chat sort of pre-programmed in a way, although we don't do a lot of that. But that trust in terms of what you build between the humans interacting is really crucial when you're talking about things that are priced at a certain point. People want to know they're getting what they think they're getting. They want to understand what they're buying by and large. And they want to have some sort of, as you said, a feeling towards the work. So, a lot of people I work with who collect, they start their collection when they travel. So they'll visit somewhere as a family and they go downtown and there's this great artist and they go to his studio and he tells them this story and they fall in love really with the artist and the place and the feeling that they have when they hear about all of this. The art then just becomes a reminder of that awesome trip, that great time together. Remember that guy? Oh, remember when we went to that like weird studio and there's a hole in the floor, and it's about the experience. And I think that's a great way to collect art. So if we can somehow create that experience through those conversations, even if that collector isn't physically in front of that piece, great. That's the goal.
Well, and I think it's interesting because part of me thinks, okay, is the vast amount of like traditional, like I'm buying my art at like Home Goods, right? Like I'm buying a print that I just love or something like that. So you have all kind of the cheap art, right? And prints and stuff. Now when we get into like collectors, somebody that might have a collection, are those artists just working with certain galleries and putting their art in certain galleries? Are you looking at bringing up art, like, because it feels like there's a little bit of a disconnect. Like first they need to know the artist, but if the artist is not getting out there to be known, how do you just start, or do you work with collectors and then go seek out what they're looking for to bring back to them? Because to me, the value in the bigger art world is maybe something that I have no understanding of, because that's just a whole different ball game, because they know some things that they're interested in. It probably gives you a genre to go about it, but are you sourcing new artists and kind of bringing them in, or is it always artists that have made a name for themselves?
Yeah, the answer is yes. It's all of the above. So through Off-Piste, we run more of a traditional gallery concept. So we have a stable of artists, and we're always adding to that stable. So probably about, I don't know, maybe close to 300 artists across all 7 galleries at this point. And they sign agreements with us where they're kind of like geographically exclusive. That's changed a lot because of the internet, as you can imagine. And artists realize, well, hey, I can kind of promote my own stuff on social media. But if you have a good partnership, a good relationship with the artist, you do right by each other. So a client comes directly to an artist that they learned about them through our gallery. That artist refers them back. So, you just need that open communication. So we work with artists like that. And the artists that we represent through our Off-Piste galleries are always contemporary. So they're living artists, they're currently creating. They only create original artwork. So we don't do reproductions or prints. And they're typically selling in the retail band of about $5,000 to $150,000. That's sort of the sweet spot for that retail. And so we look at this art as, you're going to have a collector interested in this artwork that runs the gamut from this person is looking for decor. They just moved into a new home and they need a piece to go in their living room. And it would be great if it had these colors in it and it needs to be this dimension. Great. To the person who has a full-fledged collection of post-war contemporary, Picasso and Warhol, and loves this amazing black and white photograph by David Yarrow and thinks it's going to look awesome in his den. So it really does run the full gamut. And of course, where we're located, we're in these luxury travel destinations like Whistler and Banff and Jasper. So we're getting that impulse buy sometimes, and we're getting that luxury traveler. And then we're also getting folks that live in the area. And then through my other business, through Clark Priftis Art, I'm dealing with blue chip contemporary primarily, but blue chip work. And that's when you're talking about, okay, I have one-on-one clients or family offices, and many times they will have that wish list where it's a list of 50 artists or 10 very specific artworks. I would like a Yayoi Kusama Infinity Nets piece from 1980, or it can be like, hey, I'm just starting my collecting journey. I really like abstract stuff. So it can really run the gamut. It's fun advising on all those levels. And it's really cool to see collectors of every level and stripe get excited and learn about the artist and about the artwork. That's really the ideal client, at least for me, is that one that you see them all of a sudden, the light kind of goes on, like, wow, I didn't realize that this artist knew that artist. And now I can kind of see there's a similar technique they have. And like, wow, so did that guy also know this woman? And they start to, it can become kind of an obsession. People begin to plan their travel based on art gallery openings and getting to meet an artist in their studio. And it's pretty cool. It's like any other passion, I think, playing golf, collecting fine wines, sailing, you become a bit obsessive about it. And it's pretty cool. Yeah.
Well, and that's interesting because you're then creating the experience or in some fashion. Now, from a valuation standpoint, if like, how does an artist work up from being like, selling a $5,000 piece to getting to the 150,000? Because that seems like that's the space for maybe artists that are not as well known, right? And less, and then like the Picassos and the things like that would have like a different value structure in some capacity. But is it just as they become, more I don't know, in demand, that it just starts to eke the price up? Like he can only create, she could only create so many pieces of art in a given year. And so is that, or is it really, as they start to love them? Because I can imagine some artists are not as lovable as others. Right?
Yes, that's very true. Although many times, if you think about it, It's not like other popular pop culture things in our world, right? Where, actors, obviously, exactly who they are. Even celebrity chefs, Gordon Ramsay has his own show. You can identify him. Artists, very rarely do we know who they are or know much about their personalities. It's usually, unfortunately, posthumously when we get to know about these fine artists. So it's a little less to do with that, but more to do with a lot of other variables. So this is probably the question I get asked the most, how do you invest in art? And I do a lot of talks about this. And I'll just skip right to the punchline. For most people, art is not an investment, and like 99.9% of art is not a good investment. So I would always advise people to collect. And, I use that word loosely because most people who are collectors even don't consider themselves collectors. But even if you're buying one piece, 5 pieces, or you have a group of 500 pieces, if you're collecting, do it from a place of interest, passion, excitement, because at the end of the day, most of the art is not going to be worth more than what you paid for it. And much of it may be worth less. So when you're talking about the home goods art buying experience, so that art is not going to increase in value. Think about how much joy that art is giving you on a daily basis, though. So I really kind of encourage people to think about, every time you walk into your living room and you see that really cool painting you got and you get excited about it, or it was like the missing piece that pulls together the whole space. And I have pieces like that and I love them and I never get sick of them. And then there are those pieces that, true collectors are buying where it's a missing component of the puzzle that they have. They've always wanted a Picasso lino cut, one of those things. And it becomes almost a treasure hunt. And they're looking for something of a specific quality and maybe year, like a vintage in wine, same sort of idea. Those pieces will appraise usually at a pretty high value, and then you're tracking those. There was a tool that was developed years ago called the May Moses Index, and it was the first way that people were trying to track the performance of art over time, the way that they would a traditional investment. And so they plotted the performance of blue chip artworks against the S&P 500 over the course of 20, 30 years. And the results I find incredibly misleading because you're not given a rubric for what this data really stands for. So you see both the charts and they're pretty evenly matched, S&P 500, May Moses Index, and then it kind of goes like this, and the art actually outperforms the S&P 500 a little bit. Once you know what that May Moses Index contains, it becomes a lot less compelling. So what that really is, those are about 200, works by about 200 artists. So not many artists at all. And the qualification is that those artworks had to have been sold with a public record attached to them. So really that kind of limits them to auctions. Sure. Because a lot of private sales aren't recorded. Most private sales are not recorded. Sales in galleries don't have to be publicly reported. So sold it publicly at least twice and over a certain amount of money. So we're talking about this incredibly small group of artists. P.S. over 85% of them are men, as you would suspect. And it's the greatest hits. So it's Picasso, Hockney, Warhol, Basquiat, the household names of contemporary art. Mm-hmm. Now, how many Basquiats do you own? Like personally, I own 0. So this is, and yet we can go out tomorrow and buy tons of different, we can select from tons of different stocks that we'd feel confident about investing in. So these are not the same things. Mm-hmm. One of the other things that makes this such a different market is, artwork is not liquid. If all of a sudden you have to sell your art collection tomorrow, good luck to you. What are the odds that someone is going to have the exact same taste that you had in art and that will also be qualified to spend that amount of money to purchase those things from you. It's a really, really narrow market.
Mm-hmm.
And the downside of that is, and something that has to be thought of, is when you're talking about family offices, estate planning, when you have these next generations inheriting some of these collections, the parents, we all have this about our kids. They're going to love to have this. Now, they don't like what you have. They almost never want your dusty old art. They may pick one or two pieces because there's sentimental value. There's some sort of nostalgia attached, but chances are they don't want all 400 works. The rules are different. The laws are different between here and Europe. But in the US, when you inherit artwork, you have to pay taxes on that within something like 90 days. And it is hefty. It's a 60% tax. And so if you don't have a plan in place for managing that situation, it's a massive burden for that next generation. And so that gets into discussions around, like, you need to have your artwork valued every 4 to 5 years. If you're collecting contemporary, if you're collecting ancient art, Renaissance art, a little bit less frequently than that, but be up to speed with the value of your collection. You need to preserve it. You need to take great care of it. And, that's a little wrinkle in art collecting that a lot of people don't think about. And that's where a good advisor comes in, because they'll educate their client about this. Buying the art is one part of the investment, but the long-term care, the collect stewardship of that art, is really where the big bucks come in. You're talking about climate-controlled storage, making sure if you have bronzes that they're waxed and they're polished and they're buffed twice a year. You have to clean outdoor sculptures. You have to make sure that photography has time to rest away from natural light and artificial light. You have to have professional installers recreate things. The crates can cost thousands of dollars to just build and to ship. So all these little nuances that go into the collecting experience, the true collecting experience, that just, they're not top of mind for most people.
No, and because that's what I was wondering, like if somebody had like a 500, like they're storing a lot of it, maybe they're shifting it through various homes, but a lot of the people that you're working with have bigger collections. They're doing it because they love it or whatever. I've had several clients that part of the estate plan was that there was a tremendous portion of the art that was going to be either gifted or loaned to an art museum or somewhere like that. So where are you seeing are you seeing a lot of these collectors actually transfer those to the next generation, or are they putting them in some sort of museum so that they get credit for it, or like how does that work? And why would you continue to buy like 500 pieces if it's just going to sit in a storage locker or something?
Oh, well, now you're getting into, this is a whole different industry. Well, but that goes back to the root of, why is this person collecting? And there's a million motivations for collecting. Sometimes it is pure prestige, but many times it's because the person falls in love with the act of collecting, and that can mean many things for them. But a lot of times through the collecting process, they realize that they love to get to know the artist, and they love the feeling of supporting that artist and maybe watching that artist's career really go up. So that, the famous collecting couple, the Rubels, who now have the Rubel collection and museum down in Miami, they're a great example of, they started collecting art by, at the time, pretty unknown artists. And they started collecting as a couple. It was a hobby for them that they could do together. And they loved that feeling of going into these artist studios, listening to the stories behind the work, and then, supporting them, helping them live, making a living off of selling their work. Some of these artists ended up being the biggest names now in contemporary art. Keith Haring, Basquiat again, Kehinde Wiley, and they were ahead of the curve. Now, what's interesting in the art world is that folks like the Rubels can then change the trajectory of those artists' careers. So they would put these artworks up in their home at the time and have friends over. The friends would talk about the pieces. They'd say, hey, where can I get one? And before you know it, that market was being created for that artist. So it's a pretty interesting kind of thing. So when you ask, why you have 400 pieces, why do you need 401? You're kind of addicted to all of the things that come with buying the art sometimes, the lifestyle of it, the going to the studios and the museums and everything else. But the idea of bequesting art, donating art, I think as long as you have a plan in place and it's clear, and everyone is aligned, then there's no bad plan. It's the families and the collectors that don't have a plan. And I'd say that's the majority, because art is often kind of allocated to this, we'll get to it thing. Or there's this lack of understanding of how many resources are actually wrapped up in that asset. So that's another kind of interesting point about art. People realize, of course, we have to look at the philanthropy arm of our family office. Of course, the vintage car collection needs attention. Art is sort of left to the end, and many times it's this really large part of the portfolio. So as long as there's a plan, there's no bad plan. I think what I'm seeing a lot, which is really exciting, is that this next generation of family member, and oftentimes there's a woman involved in this decision-making process, they want to do things differently. So the time of having your name on the side of a museum or having a wing named after you because you donated a collection or a piece, those are kind of going the way of the dodo. The younger generation wants to see that their philanthropy is making a true impact in the world. It's changing people's lives for better, or helping the environment overall, or really contributing to something that's bigger than them. They're more, and again, sounds kind of like old news, but it's still true. They want something that's more experience-based, especially with these ultra high net worth families and individuals. They can have this and that, they can have whatever they'd like. So what can they do that is truly unique? What can they talk about with their friends? What can they share with their family where it's legitimately a once in a lifetime experience? And so when they start to look at art through that lens, what they want to do with it really changes. So we're seeing a lot of collections being packaged either as a whole or in groupings that are then put into these loan programs for different institutions. So it might be a cadre of Latin American female artists' artworks, packaging that and putting that on tour almost, and loaning that to institutions whose funding has been massively cut. They need to really rely on independent collectors for things like this. Or maybe it's a single piece that's going to round out a museum exhibition. And so you donate that mobile and, that type of thing. So there's a different kind of take, about a dozen or so years ago, the trend was for private collectors to open up their own galleries. So I think the Prada is a great example of that, where the space is named after the family or after the person. And it's really, it's a museum, but it's a way to display your personal collection. And those have kind of, they're still opening. One of the benefits of those is you have a ton of latitude with how you want to show the art. You're not subject to some of the rules that government funded museums and institutions have to be subjected to. So you have a lot of latitude. But they can be run in a way that it's too personal. So I think families step away from that a little bit. But all to say, there's all these different ways of doing things.
And you touched on it a little bit because, women art collectors, I think, would be a little bit different, scenario. And I think even as a woman who enjoys art, like a lot of things that are in my house were created by people that I know, whether they were family or, we have a lot of artists in our family. or it has a sentimental value, like that it does, like, oh, I got it there on this trip and we went here. And even I have a client that, I don't have it up today, I guess I should have had it up today, a client that gifted me some beautiful artwork as well. But how are women art collectors changing? But are they also changing that they're seeking out more women artists,
Yes.
right? Okay. And even like world, like I would definitely want to buy art or something from somebody in more of a third world where it's, impacting their life and things like that. So where do you see it shifting, because either younger people are investing, or women are investing that maybe we didn't see before?
Yeah, I mean, years ago when that May Moses Index was started, for example, I think it was 100% male artists at the time. And so we've seen that change. There's more women who have moved into that blue chip space, and deservedly so. They were just sidelined for years and years. But contemporaries of male contemporary artists who have been popular and selling at record levels for years, they're finally getting their due. So, photographers like Cindy Sherman, for example, she's really moved into that space. Tracy Emin, the former young British artist who does sort of mixed media and installation art, has moved into that space. Still woefully underrepresented in permanent collections and institutions, but that's where we're starting to see a shift. So we're seeing more women in positions of power in these major art institutions. And as they're stepping into those roles, they have more control and say over who gets a spot in that permanent collection. And because of that, we're seeing a little bit of a shift, which is great. Same with the board demographics. So institutions typically have an acquisitions committee, and they'll meet a couple times a year. There's a slate of proposed acquisitions put in front of them, and they decide based on budget, makeup of the collection, needs of the facility, all sorts of stuff, what pieces they're going to buy that year and add to the permanent collection. And that board complexion is changing too, for the better. It's much more diverse than it used to be, and so we're seeing that shift because of that as well. Think about 20 years ago, most major collections only had about 20% of the holdings were artworks created by women. Now it's about double that. So that's really encouraging. Now, women's artwork is still not achieving the record sales that men's work is. And so there's a lot of space to make up. There's a lot of places to go with that. But it's all moving in the right direction. The younger generation of collectors, I think where we see them influencing things, they're much more willing to take risks on lesser known artists. And I think part of that we can attribute to their comfort with social media. So unlike an older generation that might not buy that thing online because we haven't seen it in person before, they're native to shopping online, that this is a comfortable space for them. So they'll take a chance, and so online sales of artwork through social media, that is primarily driven by younger people, by a younger generation of collector. And it's really cool to see. Something else that's been identified, which was actually surprising to me, is that younger people who consider themselves collectors, so they're buying art on a relatively regular basis, they don't intend to hold the artwork in perpetuity. They're inclined to sell that piece at some point or think about trading it for something else. So very interesting mindset about collecting. They don't want to amass necessarily this large group of works. They want to continue to refresh what they have. So it'll be interesting to see what they kind of end up with when they're in this position of deaccessioning.
Yeah, I mean, it's so many things that you talked about that I didn't even consider, because I think that the younger generation would want to transfer out things like, oh, I'm redoing my living room, like that was a great piece of art, like it's almost like you're going to end up creating a secondary market that is going to be, okay, what art do you have? Are they equivalent in value, right? And let's exchange them, or, an exchange kind of network that would be.
Completely see that happening. I mean, single-handedly, they've been responsible for elevating sneakers to the collecting category. Who saw that coming 50 years ago? Now there's a whole luxury goods section at Sotheby's, Christie's, and Phillips, and it's handbags, it's sneakers and scarves and things. And I mean, there's some of the most heavily attended auctions now.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about you,
Sure.
how people can reach out to you, because we've talked a little bit about value. You're an appraiser, and so you can look at these things. And in my mind, there isn't a good rubric of how to value this art if you're in a situation where you would need to value it for estate or things like that. Like it's not going to be easy for somebody like me to be like, oh, I value businesses, so let me go over here and value art. But you have an amazing amount of information and knowledge from being 30 plus years in this space. If somebody has questions about it, how can they reach out to you? Can you tell us a little bit about the two companies that you actually are involved in and run? And we'll show some information about how people can reach out to you. And then we'll talk a little bit about how we got to know each other.
Yeah, sure.
But tell us about your companies and how either somebody who wants to collect or to understand more about maybe the value of their own collection, if they need to, because 60% taxes on, like leaving it in your collection, that is not a good estate planning idea.
That's not a plan.
It's not a plan.
I always say no plan is not a plan. So put something in place. Treat it like you would any other major investment in your life, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I kind of call myself like the Swiss Army knife of the art world. So now that we've all met, just feel free to reach out to me with anything that's art related. You're going on a trip, you want to know if you can get tickets to some art exhibition, give me a call. You have a friend who inherited a painting from their grandmother and you don't know what it's worth, send me an email. Because I really do sort of all of the above. But Off-Piste Fine Art, again, we're a Canadian-based company that owns and operates 7 physical galleries under 3 different brands: Whistler Contemporary Gallery, Sun Valley Contemporary, and Mountain Galleries. And each one has like a little bit of a different flavor to it. But we represent contemporary artists of all different mediums. So photography, painting, sculpture, mixed media, etc. Traditional gallery model, brick and mortar, and we have these great websites. My business, Ann Priftis Art, is an advisory firm. So I act as an art advisor for people collecting everything from emerging art to blue chip art, and advising on everything in between. So if you're a business and you have a large collection of art, but you need to divest of that art, or you're changing offices and you need everything reframed and to buy new art, that's where I come in. And then I'm a business advisor for the art world. So you're opening up a gallery for the first time. I come in and I build a sales program for you, or I oversee the general build out, the construction of the gallery. There's specific things you need when you're building out a gallery, as you would with any other industry, like a restaurant, for example. So a little bit of everything. Having your artwork professionally appraised and having a professional advisor in your corner is absolutely invaluable. Just like any other specialty, any other profession, there's a major difference between someone who's really doing it as a living and Googling things and chat GPTing it. Now, as a big fan of chat GPT, we were just talking about this earlier, I'm not poo-pooing that. However, when you get to a certain level with things like appraisals, you can't mess around. You need a real valuation by a trained person where that document can stand up in a court of law and can pass the sniff test by the IRS, because that's really what you're using it for. So I just recommend, and I have a lot of resources that I can share with people too, if you wanted to, try to find someone who specializes in antique rugs, for example, or manuscripts and things like that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't see, that's why I loved that, I was introduced to you, and because the amount of knowledge that you have, like this is an area that you have to have an expert, just period, point blank. Like we can't just go Google and be like, oh, what's Picasso sold for? Like, and in the art world, I feel like there's some volatility in some of this as well. I think you gave some good rubrics, but we'll kind of close off because I know you need to get going too. But we know each other from a book that we're going to be putting together that has to do with money and women and, the great wealth transfer and all of these things. But how are you involved in this project? And can you tell us a little bit more about it? And you're actually doing some artwork, and trying to source some artwork for a publication. So that's an interesting, little different context as well.
Yeah, that's right. Rochelle reached out when she came up with the concept for this book, From Echo to Athena, which uses the Greek myths based on women to talk about wealth and how women are stewarding family wealth now and kind of going forward into the future during this time of the great wealth transfer. So I do write a lot and speak a lot about women in family offices, specifically how they relate to the family office art collection, the family art collection, and investing in art. And so she found me through that thread, basically. But yes, I'll be sourcing some art for this publication and then writing a chapter about women investing in art. So very excited.
Yeah, very exciting.
Some amazing women through the project. So it's been great to meet you.
Right. And I think I'm writing a chapter basically on, negotiation around the money and things like that. So From Echo to Athena, we hope is going to be coming out, late 2025, early 2026. Hopefully, maybe we'll have an opportunity to go to a gallery and have a little bit of a book opening or a book signing.
We would love to host one in one of our galleries. Wonderful. Yeah.
I love that. So, well, I appreciate all of the information. I think I probably enjoyed the conversation a little bit too much, so I hope our audience did as well. But if we ever have any more questions, please reach out to Ann, and we hope to maybe see you back after we've written the book. We'll talk a little bit more about that in another episode. So, thanks,
that would be great. Thank you so much, Melissa. I appreciate it.
All right. Talk to you soon.